Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. And I'm sorry for the slight tech issues that are going on there. We couldn't really work out whether we broadcasted or not. So let's jump into our next session. So we've got a great session lined up on effective leadership in the new work order. And we're joined by Juliet Alban-Metcalfe, Chartered Occupational Psychologist, Chief Executive of the Real World Group and Adjunct Associate Professor at the Centre for Sustainable Business and Enterprise at the University of Southern Queensland, Australia. Juliet, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Craig, and it's great to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation from Nikki for me to be here. I'm really delighted to be here. What I'm going to be talking about today, as Craig mentioned, is effective leadership in the new work order. I don't know how people feel about how we describe where we are now, how we're moving forward. I'm avoiding using the word new normal because I appreciate that's something that, is a bit Marmite. But certainly I think we can all recognise that we're in a whole new phase of the world in general, but also how we work. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'll start sharing my slides, I think, now. Okay, perfect. So what I'm going to do is I'll briefly introduce us at Real World Group. What I'm going to talk about is I'm going to talk about 5 key things we need to be aware of as leaders in order to be effective as we continue to move through COVID and move into hopefully an even brighter and more exciting future. Real World Group's been around for 20 years. What we do is we do academic quality research, try to understand what drives performance through day-to-day leadership behaviour, through team activities and through organisational culture. And then we create assessment tools that are distributed in 17 countries around the world. Many of you will be familiar with our founding director, Professor Beverly Alban-Metcalfe. She's a lot more famous than Real World Group, but certainly we're all about her research and the research we've built on since the beginning. So let's start then. The first thing that I think is really, really important is for people to recognise that leadership can't be successful unless we are aware of and reacting to the context in which the world is at the moment. Now, that might seem really obvious, but what we can see from organisations is that organisations might know it, but they're not necessarily living it. So we're seeing people leading in ways that aren't representative or aren't reacting to the way that the world is now. Now, in the past, to try to understand the context of leadership, we've used the acronym VUCA, which I'm sure many of you will be used to and will have perhaps you'll use it a lot in the work that you do. So we talked about the world being volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. You may or may not be familiar with a new way of describing the world, which is describing the world as being BANI, which is a phrase and an acronym that's been designed by Germaeus Cassio. Now, what BANI describes is it describes the world as being brittle. And by this, we can think of things like the impact of Brexit, how it's totally, Spanish in many ways, smashed apart the way we used to know the world, the way things used to be certain and used to be sort of predictable and used to be things we could rely on. As a result of all the unknowns in the world and the fast pace of change, it's a much more anxious place to be in, to work. It's also much more non-linear. It's very difficult to predict the direction of things, and direction can change overnight. And it's pretty incomprehensible as a result of all of those other things. We don't have time to catch up, to really kind of catch our breath and to start to predict what's next. It's very much an incomprehensible world that we're living in. And what that means then for leaders is we've absolutely got to reduce complacency. There is so much complacency in leadership today. There has been for a long time. Let's hope we can use this opportunity of enormous change, of increased pressure to really help our organisations and our people to thrive. If we want people to be able to be successful in a BANI world, we need to make sure that we're protecting and maintaining their well-being, that we're not burning them out with our demands without being, the supportive and nurturing leaders we need to be. We need to make sure that they remain motivated to work for us, that they remain both committed, not just to the work that they do, but also our organisations. We need them to feel confident, to feel confident, and to have high change readiness and resilience as a result of all those other things. Resilience can't be taught on its own. It comes from people feeling confident, feeling motivated, feeling committed, and so on. So those are the things we need to do in order to recognise and rise the challenge of the world in which we're living in now. An added complication, of course, is hybrid working, or another way you might say the added complication, you might say, well, actually, that was COVID. That was the added complication. An interesting piece of research that describes really nicely where we're at was conducted by Sharon Parker and colleagues in Australia. And it was undertaken in 2020, so during much more of the height of the pandemic that we're in now, potentially, arguably. But it really summarizes nicely where we're at, albeit quite a challenging situation. Now, what Sharon Parker and her colleagues did was they surveyed, I think it was just under 2,000 people from around the world, asking leaders and employees who weren't in leadership roles about how they felt about hybrid working, about how they felt about remote working. And what they found was that 60% of leaders who responded to their survey either agreed that people worked less well outside the office, or they weren't sure. So it's not exactly a ringing endorsement for people believing that people can work as well when they're not there in person in front of them. What the effect of people suddenly having to work from home, for a significant amount of time during the pandemic, of course, not in all professions by any means, but in many parts of the world and many parts of organizations, was that it really exposed weaker leadership and a lack of confidence people had in their direct reports and their teams. What that led to, as you'll have heard from many people, perhaps you experienced yourself, was it led to leaders feeling out of control, therefore trying to regain control by becoming even more micromanaging in their behavior, becoming even more command and control. It was people not trusting each other, and it led to some real dysfunctional behaviors. Like, for example, we know that the rise of surveillance technology has become increasingly popular since there's been more remote working or more hybrid teams. And we know that people have introduced some kinds of really counterproductive rules, like, you better make sure you're in front of your laptop at this, random times of the day, we'll be turning your camera on to make sure you're working. So really what's happened is in organizations, and we're not seeing enough of a swing away from this yet, despite the fact that we're now 18 months into a COVID world, that it's really led to some real dysfunctional behaviors in organizations. And what's been missing, some research by the Institute for Employment Studies showed, is that very few people have still been provided with training and guidance on how to lead people in a hybrid way or when they're away from the office. Now, what happens, of course, when we trust people less, when we put more pressure on them, is we increase their levels of stress. We increase their anxiety about doing the wrong thing or not being seen to be, present or around at the right kind of time. We put further pressure on people's mental health. Now, forget emergency medicine for a moment. If you think about any organization, in most sectors, you'll find that even pre-pandemic, the World Health Organization was deeply worried about the state of well-being organizations. People's levels of stress were far too high, and particularly caused job-related stress they talked about. Now, it's even worse now if you look at some of the research around here. And so the way leaders are operating is making a bad situation, far worse. What, of course, happens when we feel anxious and when we feel stressed is we're more distracted, our performance suffers. And then what happens, of course, is that there becomes this perfectly reinforcing circle of people aren't working as well outside the office, in some cases because of leadership, rather than because of some innate, lack of commitment or motivation or competence or whatever, So what we need to do, absolutely, when it comes to moving towards more of a hybrid or remote working culture, I haven't got time to go into this in great detail, but as you probably know, most organizations are looking at it for whatever functions it's possible for in big ways. But what we need to understand is about supporting leaders, because not only do we need to help them think about these new ways of working, but also we can see is it's exposed cracks that were already there. So going back to my previous point, leadership is not strong or not strong enough in many organizations. And hopefully the cracks that are being exposed now will help us to actually do something about it. Will build some impetus about doing something about it. Second thing is about the importance of having the confidence as leaders to role model humility. I know a lot of people have talked about psychological safety at this conference so far. The brilliant graphical artistry that's been created has psychological safety at the core. But I want to sort of very briefly go through a couple of studies that I think you'll find interesting. There have been a number of pieces of research by Amy Edmondson and colleagues looking at healthcare in particular and leadership and psychological safety. And some of the things that we know are that, for example, high-performing teams, actually, when you look at them at face value, you might think, and this is what Amy Edmondson found in some of her research, they seem to make more mistakes than low-performing teams. But then when you look in more detail, actually what you learn is they're actually, the difference is they're admitting to more mistakes than low-performing teams are. But what we know is that what is critical is that we create cultures in teams in which people are able to treat failure as an acceptable outcome. It's about learning and about having the culture in which people feel able to admit when they don't know, when they might have made a mistake, when things haven't gone to plan, and so on. Those things are critical. We know that about psychological safety. But what we don't, I think, focus on enough is that it comes down to leaders' behavior as to whether teams are psychologically safe or not. Just describing whether people feel psychologically safe isn't going to do anything. And we can't rely on training employees to speak up. We can't rely on employees to sort of admit when they think that things aren't working in a team, for teams to become safer, and for, the way that we care for our customers, for our communities to become more effective. We've actually got to start with leaders. What we know from Amy Edmondson's research on different, teams and different forms of organizational outcome is that the key things for leaders to do is to have the confidence to move away from positional power, to actually be inclusive, to try to actively reduce hierarchy. And as a result, they create much greater learning, they create much greater safety in terms of how the team operates. So it comes down to the leader. We mustn't be putting the onus on our staff if we don't start with a leader to begin with. Another piece of research, which we're probably familiar with, I don't know if it's been mentioned at the conference so far, is Project Aristotle that Google undertook, which was an enormous piece of research looking at trying to establish what made successful teams within Google. So a completely different context. Their initial assumption was that outstanding teams are such because of the people within them, in terms of their competencies, their seniority, that it might even be a mix of people. In actual reality, they found that whether competency, skill, and experience had varying results. They also found that things like management, strength, team structure, seniority, and so on had no correlation with success that was any of statistical significance. But actually, the one thing that made the difference, of course, was the norms by which the team worked together. Primarily, whether there was psychological safety in the team, whether the team felt that they were able to admit when they didn't know something, when they were able to make mistakes, when they felt safe because of the way the culture worked, which of course primarily comes from the leader. And leaders, one of the things that's critical, of course, to being able to create a culture like this is starting with oneself and being confident enough to say, don't know the answer, and that we're learning together. And moving towards different ways of working is an ideal opportunity for people to say, I genuinely don't know, let's learn together. So let's grab this opportunity. Okay, so the third thing is that we need to understand as leaders and enact the key drivers of human effort every day. Really critical that every day through our behavior and our actions, we enact the key drivers of human effort. What we need in teams, just to recap what I've been talking about, we need to have change readiness. We need people to be thinking differently all the time so that we can improve what we do, and we need to embrace innovation as well as it comes through. It's incredibly fast now, particularly in healthcare. We need to increase resilience. We need to enable people to do more with less, or more with, if they're lucky, the same resources as before, and maintain well-being. That all comes from the leadership culture an individual creates and an organization has through how people operate, what their beliefs are, what their values are. On a day-to-day basis, it means that leaders ensure their teams have a sense of meaning of what they do, that they understand why what they do is important, even if they're not the biggest experts in inverted commas in an organization, that they have a line of sight between their work and the work of the organization and the outcomes of the organization, that they understand when things have changed, that they're informed, and they don't feel like they're last to know important bits of information about what priorities are in the organisation, for example. It's about people having a sense of autonomy in the work that they do. We know that people need varied levels of autonomy, but it's about getting to know your people and understanding what's appropriate at a given time. But it's not just about autonomy on its own. It's about, one of the things that's often missing in leadership is clarity of expectations. One of the worst things that we can do to people is to give them increased autonomy without supporting them to become more competent and more effective in a given area. So it's increasing it's giving them stretch assignments, increasing their competence, their realm of responsibility, but coaching them and having their back if they don't get it right first time. And then it's about appreciation of too. Again, appreciation is still, you think, oh, we've been talking about it for 20, 30 years, maybe 40 years. It's still so lacking in organisations. The day-to-day thank yous, the thank yous people have really busted and gone the extra mile. We cannot underemphasise the importance of doing more appreciation than we do, engaging in more appreciation than we do. But also a part of appreciation is about making people feel valued for the contribution that they make. So it's about giving them a sense of status, as David Rock talks about, and we look at the neuroscience. It's about people knowing that they're valued for the work that they do, for what they bring to the table. It's about asking their opinion to make them understand and be able to contribute the best of themselves to the team and the organisation. Makes a huge difference. Psychological safety, of course, is critical in how we behave day to day, and we can't be inconsistent in this. We really can't. And finally, social support. Of course, manager to team, but also encouraging social support between team members as a leader is critical. So that's really critical, is that we do that. And what, of course, we know is that in hybrid teams, the leadership behaviours that are required are just the same as in face-to-face teams. But it's about, you've really got to make that effort to make sure that you're in touch with all your team members, and whether it's more difficult than when they're in person. But it's fundamentally the same behaviours that create high-performing hybrid teams as create in-person teams. Second, penultimate issue, fourth, we need to stop expecting personality to have all the answers. Now, understanding people's personality traits, their preferences, their innate drivers and so on, is critical in so many different ways. It's really useful, for example, for interpersonal communications. It can be really, really useful for selecting people into the right kind of role. But it is massively overestimated when it comes to leadership. I'd like to explain why. We need to think, beyond personality. Despite an individual personality, this is what we expect in terms of behaviours, and this is what they're able to behave, where they're able to behave, and things they're able to enact. So what do I mean by that? As psychologists, when we understand what drives performance, what creates a high-performing leader or a high-performing team, we break down what the aspects are of individuals. The first aspect of an individual is the values that they have, that they might have instilled in childhood, or you might, as you grow up, you might accept or reject the values that were instilled in childhood, but at your core, you'll have the values that you hold dear. Now, those are expressed in terms of our attitudes to the world, how we think things are, how we think things should be and shouldn't be, how we believe people should operate or not operate, those kinds of things. And in turn, we can understand them to a certain extent when they organise themselves into personality attributes or traits or motivations and preferences and so on and so forth. But ultimately, personality is not right next to performance. What's right next to performance is behaviour. So personality influences behaviour to a degree, and then behaviour influences directly performance. But what people are often surprised to learn is that actually less than 10% of job performance is explained by personality, less than 10%. And the reason for that is that, for example, there are so many workplace factors that influence how we have to behave, regardless of how we might prefer to behave. So, for example, there's the global context. If you have a think, COVID-19 is a perfect example of how the global context has meant that overnight we've had to operate completely differently to how we might prefer. For some of us, it's brilliant working from home, but for other people, it's the worst thing ever. But in many, many more ways than that, it's influenced how we work. Then, even without global pandemics, there's the organizational context and the priorities, how political changes influence us, how sectoral changes, how innovations, and so on. And there's what the role requires that influences your behavior on a day-to-day basis, what your colleagues need from you, what your team members need from you, the demands of the job that fly in and fly out, and so on and so forth. There are so many things that affect the ways we have to behave, regardless of what our preference might be, and or what our natural inclination might be, that it kind of effectively fractures, if not really, really weakens the relationship between personality and behavior. So we need to look beyond personality if we're going to explain what is critical for leaders to do in order to be effective in the new work order. Now, the liberating thing about this is that it means that being highly effective is within everyone's control. So you don't have to be an ENTJ to be an effective leader. You don't have to be a certain, combination of factors or a certain color to be an effective leader. It's within all of us if we choose to enact the behaviors that are required. And the final thing I wanted to say is that we absolutely need to start at the very top of organizations. So like with psychological safety, we cannot expect to we can't expect to train people to talk up, to feel safe in that. We've got to start by looking at ourselves as leaders. Are we creating the conditions in which people feel that they can speak up, that they are able to give their very best in the organization? And this is particularly important when it comes to organizational culture, of course, that we start at the beginning of, the very top of the organization. So we have got to get the most senior managers and the board on board. We've absolutely got to. I don't know what your experiences are, but my experience is that unfortunately boards and the most senior executive teams often resist reflection, save for the occasional introspection, whether it's, I heard an outrageous example the other day of a executive team who've all undertaken MBTI recently, and that was their board or executive team evaluation for the year and reflection and learning. And the outrageous thing about it is that they've now told the rest of the organisation, these are the personality types of the executive team members, and we expect you to be cognizant of that and be aware of that, and be, to reflect that in how you work with them. I haven't got time to go. I haven't got time to talk about how outrageous that is in all kinds of different ways. But what we find is that people, that was just an aside, what we find is that people, that boards might agree to a self-assessment. They might agree to undertake, I don't know, EQ learning or personality reflection, or it might even be behavioural but self-assessment based. But what happens, of course, is that when you rely on self-assessment for learning, it actually just reinforces delusion and it enables greater complacency rather than true learning. And we know that because we've seen, and I'll show you in a moment, some examples of 360 feedback. But one of the things I'm going to show to you before I go on to that is that when it comes to boards and executive teams, in fact, any leader in general, it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't true. And what I mean by that is that when we look at, so one of the behavioural tools that we have is we have a board 360 and we have an executive team 360. And I have a huge amount of respect for the boards and teams that undertake these tools because they are outside of the norm. But what we see when we get the results back is that the boards and executive teams always overrate themselves in a large number of areas, if not across the board, compared to everybody else. So what that means, of course, is that if we only provide self-assessment or no reflection, then 99% of boards or executive teams are going to continue doing the wrong thing and miss the things that they do well, because we also find in some areas they underrate themselves. And so they don't know what they're doing well, and they don't know what they're doing that they need to change. So we really must encourage people to actually actively gather feedback. And I'll give you a couple of examples before I finish. The first one, here's an example, and these are from real boards and executive teams over the years. This is an example of an item from the Board 360. Does the board communicate positive expectations of what staff and managers can achieve? The board, the blue line, rates itself, where you see that dotted red line, that's where the average rating goes from slightly agree to agree. So even the board itself doesn't really think that it communicates positive expectations of what staff and managers can achieve. And staff and managers, internal groups 1 and 2, certainly, in fact, those are just the most senior managers, they certainly don't feel that that the board believes in what they can achieve. And imagine how demoralizing that is. In terms of visibility and listening, of course, you can imagine we've adapted this question since the pandemic, but this is about executive team members keep in touch with what's going on in the organisation by walking around, talking and listening. And that black line is a range bar. What was the minimum and the maximum? That's quite a narrow range bar for the executive team. They kind of vaguely around the same belief, but it's just a 4. They slightly agree they do that. One of the groups of senior managers gets to see them much more than the other one does, or is approached more than the other one does. So again, a great critical area of learning, and such a basic thing to do to be effective in their leading of the organisation. And then finally, his last example, the executive team encourages people to question traditional ways of doing things at all levels in the organisation to improve quality, safety and effectiveness. Executive team itself is pretty convinced there's not much range in their beliefs, but they only just agree that they do that. But their direct reports feel quite differently. Now, if they don't encourage a learning culture, how can they expect that anybody else will have the confidence to do that? So that's all I wanted to say today. I hope you found it useful. I apologise, it's a real whistle-stop tour. If you want any of the articles that I've referenced or research I've referenced, please feel free to get in touch. And in answer to someone's question earlier on, Jackie, I'm very happy to share my slides. I'd be delighted to. So I shall stop sharing at this point. Linda Garrett shared a really useful comment here. Sadly, I've come across very senior people using personality assessments to justify and excuse unhelpful behaviours. I just don't do detail. Oh gosh, I know, it's just so depressing that people do that, to think that it's ever excusable. But then to have, a so-called verified assessment to reinforce that it's acceptable. Oh my goodness, where do we even start? And there's, yes, preference, not ability. Yeah, I mean, so we're expecting Craig to arrive in a moment. I absolutely think personality tools have a really, especially the well-researched ones, have a really important role to play in organisational life. My concern is their massive over-application to leadership and what that misses out. If you look at I mentioned earlier on, the key drivers of human effort, they're not understood by personality. They're not addressed by good quality personality tools. So we need to look beyond personality as well with senior leaders. I don't know if anyone's got any questions at all. Look at the Q&A. We don't have any questions there at the moment. Right, Craig's having technical issues. Does anybody want to put a question in the chat box? Or Nikki, perhaps you might want to just usher me off this stage. Here she is.
Hello. I'm not dressed today. I dressed nicely yesterday because I was on camera, but not for today.
Always the case, isn't it?
It is. So Craig's having a few technical issues, so I'm here to if there's any final questions from any. I think we've got a question. Do you have a preferred tool, Juliet, that you use? Linda's asking.
Well,
your own.
Pardon?
Obviously your own.
Well, I was going to say, in terms of leadership behaviours, we've got a massive suite of research-based tools. When it comes to, but I'm not here to promote Real World Group. When it comes to personality, really well validated tool is Wave. I don't know if anyone used that before. Yeah. So that's a really good tool for recruiting into senior roles. But also you really want to make sure that you talk about behaviours when it comes to recruitment as well. So even from the recruitment stage all the way through, you need to be thinking about behaviours too. You absolutely, it's critical, really critical.
Great. So Linda's just recently been accredited to Wave. I use Wave in my practice as well. I love it. I think it's really good. So I think we've come to a natural end, Juliet, of your section. Really want to thank you for your input and real valuable research. And like you said, there's so much that you could talk about. So keeping you to to a small section was quite difficult, I'm sure, but it's really good to have you. And as you said, we will share all the slides from all the sessions that we've had over the last couple of days. So thank you, Juliet. I need to now introduce the next speaker. So see you soon.